Hello, and welcome to this screencast on expanding horizons of cross cultural interaction, which is chapter 21 in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. It could also be the subtitle for the entire book, because this is really what's happening in world history is that the horizons of cross cultural interaction have grown larger to the point where we live in a globalized world today. So, as a result, this is a pretty important chapter. I would say chapters 21 and 22 form kind of the hinges of the world history story as told by traditions and encounters, which is kind of one way that historians have told this story. So there are the big ideas in here are quite big. Let's take a look. Kind of see twin big ideas in this chapter that relate to the three key concepts that relate to this time period. But you can look at it in a couple ways. One is that the expanding connections across land and sea eventually become global. And Bentley and Ziegler include the ocean connections with the Atlantic Ocean. They put them at the end of this chapter as a way to see that is a result of expanding interactions that had been happening, throughout the Middle Ages. Secondly, those voyages are funded by more powerful states. So powerful here is going to mean in terms of militaries and resources. At the two ends of Eurasia, in Western Europe, the Atlantic facing states, it's going to be England, Netherlands, France, Portugal, Spain, and then in East Asia, dynastic China. At the micro, so that's at the macro level, right? Big world map, big states. The micro level, there's two travelers who really exemplify the biggest key concept in this time period of communication and exchange. And both of these people are quite significant as sources for world historians. And in fact, students, even before they've read chapter 21, may well come across things written by Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, or at least attributed to them. In both cases, somebody else wrote it down, actually. We have that. Polo is important as a source because the book becomes popular in Europe. So it has an effect on other people. In fact, Christopher Columbus had a copy of Marco Polo's book with him, which he thought might be a useful guide. Since he didn't know that the Americas existed, he wound up thinking that China was Cuba, or when he was in Cuba, they was in China. So it maybe caused more problems than it was useful as a guide. But still, it had a big effect. Columbus's voyage is one of the most important world historical events. Ibn Battuta is also in this chapter, and he is a useful source of information for this time period in Africa and in South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Southwest Asia. So then in Africa, Northwest and East. So that's 7 regions in the AP World History curriculum. So these are both important sources, and they're worthy of study all by themselves and for what they tell us about other places. Communication and exchange networks then lead to diffusion. That's one of the power vocabulary words here. Remember, diffusion is connected to trade, but it's not the same thing. Diffusion is when things spread to a new place and then stay there. So Europeans start manufacturing gunpowder after it diffuses across Eurasia from East Asia. Okay. Sugar cane is originally from Southeast Asia or southern China, and by the end of this period, it's a plant that's being grown in the Mediterranean. And unfortunately, pathogens like Yersinia pestis, which caused the bubonic plague or Black Death, when they came to places in East Asia and in the Middle East and Africa and Europe, they came and they lived there. Okay. There's been a lot of genetic research on the Black Death, aka the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages. And so you should know that there's the story in Bentley and Ziegler is probably somewhat out of date because we're looking at the 5th edition, which is now 7 or 8 years old at least. And there's been the genetic research has changed some things that historians know, but the general story is still true. It's probably a bacteria that's existed for longer than human beings in Central Asia, and then human beings came upon it, expanding their networks for exchange or resource gathering, and then through the trade routes spread, across Eurasia and then into Africa. Communication and exchange then takes an oceanic turn, if you will, and in the next time period, one of the biggest concepts is transoceanic connection. So that's we're building up to that. That happened from China into the Indian Ocean, and you should know about Zheng He. Keep track of like who he was and what he accomplished and these gigantic treasure ships that he used. And then at the end of the chapter, which Bentley and Ziegler put in this section of the book leading up to 1500, but in the AP World Curriculum is in the next time period. We'll see Portugal and Spain, the Iberian countries, expanding into the Atlantic. Especially pay attention to Portugal, which is a country that fewer world history students know about than Spain, because there's less cultural connections directly to the United States. So you can see there that going along the west coast of Africa and then eventually getting into the Indian Ocean. So definitely within this time period in the 1400s, Portuguese sea voyages going further and further down the West African coast. And at first, they're not looking to get to Asia. They're looking to find allies in the Reconquista, the fight between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. They're looking for allies potentially to fight against the Ottoman Muslims, the Ottoman Empire. And they're looking for gold, the gold that had been coming across the Sahara and some of the other products, including ivory, that were coming across the Sahara, and some trade and enslaved people, which is going to obviously become much bigger in the next time period. But here it's really gold and allies are the focus. The first Portuguese fort in West Africa is Elmina, the mine, or not the first, but one of the first that's pretty far away from Portugal, the mine. I mean, it tells you what you need to know. They're coming looking for gold. So in a lot of ways, it's an extension of that trans-Saharan trade into the Mediterranean that we saw earlier, a few different places in this time period. The 14th century is a temporary exception to some general trends in Eurasia. Is really what this is referring to, both ends of Eurasia, where the population had been going up because the increasing productivity of agriculture. This has come up in different chapters with different field systems and new crops of rice and better agricultural equipment. But you have declining populations in, from Europe all the way to China, and that in part is about the plague. And then there's also some climatic variations, and then that leads to rebellions, and all those things are bad for food production. Southwest Asia, what we call the Middle East, really suffers a double hammer blow of epic historical proportions, where an area that had been invaded by the Mongols is then subject to plague. I mean, that is two big blows to any region. So we have that. So you kind of pay attention to the social effects from this, like that's illustrated here. Second big, so that all those slides, that was all just expanding, exchange networks. That's the biggest concept in this time period, and you saw all those things that are happening. Okay. Here is the other big idea that I noted at the beginning, and that is the increasing power of states. So coming out of this calamitous 14th century, as some textbooks call it, in China, the Ming Dynasty was established that followed the traditional Chinese path and replaced the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol one. And so centralized state, good government, the scholar bureaucrats, Confucian or Neo-Confucian at this point, traditions, creating a powerful, stable state. Now in Europe, you have decentralization is still there, meaning there's not one empire like the way there's China. So China is not equivalent to France. China is equivalent to Europe, except that it's centralized into one state. In Europe, though, some of these regional states or sub-regional states like France, England, Russia start to develop more powerful monarchies. And those monarchies are based on the ability to tax, the monarch taxing, and then building independent militaries, meaning independent from the noble lords. There's less feudalism, more centralized governmental power in the monarchies. And then another state form, which continues to exist during this time period, which we had seen earlier, are the city states in northern Italy, especially, and there's also some city states in the Baltic area in Europe. And this will be happening. The book doesn't talk about this, but back in chapter 18, the city states in the Swahili coast. So one thing you notice is that city states happen when in areas that are very commercial, where there's a lot of commerce, where business is what's sustaining the area. Finally, this section does talk about the Renaissance, or really the European Renaissance, because the word Renaissance just means rebirth. And so there's lots of Renaissances in world history. You could even think about Neo-Confucianism as a kind of Renaissance. There's in the period, at the same time, there's a Renaissance in Central Asia that's happening with a lot of Golden Age of Islam architecture and learning being revived. But this here, you can take the European Renaissance that happened in Italy and involved some really cool looking buildings like the Duomo here, which is also kind of fun to say. Duomo. The Duomo or Dome in Florence. And it shows a couple themes though from world history. One is there is exchange. There's a lot of academic influence from the Muslim world. One of the Renaissance, the rebirth part, is that people are reading classical Latin in Europe, classical meaning from like ancient times, and classical Greek. And in a lot of cases, they're exposed to those through Muslim scholars. And then eventually want to go back and read the sources themselves, not in translations from Arabic. And that kind of creates this rebirth. Okay. And it's also happening in northern Italy, where the hemispheric trade has created prosperity, and that prosperity then creates a surplus, and that surplus can fuel things like art and scholarship. So you can read more about that there, but you should know that the European Renaissance is not as big of a subject in a world history class, of course, as it would be in a European history class. Okay. So those are the themes. So you're looking for stronger states that are existing as part of increasingly hemispheric-wide commerce that gets big enough that it spills over into global exchange that would begin the next period. All right. Thanks for listening. Good luck.